As we know that the lyrical ballad is thought the most important document of romantic age, romantic poetry, and it is joint venture of William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge. Wordsworth wrote most of the poems. He wrote preface to lyrical ballad, and he advocated a new school of thought in poetry. Coleridge endorsed many of the points of Wordsworth, but he had his own view. He didn't agree preface, and he wrote many years later, we can say about 18, 19 years after, that was 1817, when his work Biographia Literaria was published. In Biographia Literaria, he expressed his own ideas of poetry and explained those points where he had difference of opinion with William Wordsworth. यानी जो वर्ड्सवर्थ के साथ कॉलरिज के इख्तिलाफात थे उसको भी बयान किया और अपने नुक्ता नज़र को भी बयान किया। और कॉलरिज जो है खुद रोमांटिक पोइट्री में सबसे बड़ा जो है वो थ्योरिस्ट बन के सामने आया, स्पेशली फॉर हिज आइडियाज ऑफ इमेजिनेशन एंड इट्स टू टाइप्स, प्राइमरी एंड सेकेंडरी इमेजिनेशन। Though most of Coleridge ideas, they were actually borrowed from German philosopher Kant, but in English he was thought matchless in his ideas. Probably no poet had experience of both, you can say experience as a poet and voice as a critic, though there was a long tradition of a poet critic. Dryden was poet critic, Wordsworth was poet critic, Coleridge was poet critic, and in coming years we see even T.S. Eliot poet critic. But Coleridge was unique, you can say, for his ideas and for his poetic creations and for his critical thoughts. Coleridge is known for his, you can say, many poems, or like the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, that is thought is best. Kublafaan, that is thought, you can say, the best of English poetry. And Christabel, Ode, Dejection, Ode Nightingale. So Wordsworth and Coleridge, when they are introduced, it is said Wordsworth is a poet of nature and Coleridge is a poet of supernatural world. But that is too generalized idea. We can see Coleridge's best poems, The Rhyme of Ancient Mariner. The Rhyme of Ancient Mariner is a poem where there is a scene of a wedding banquet, and on that wedding banquet, one of the guests relates the story of a mariner, a sailor, यानी एक समंदरी मल्लाह की कहानी जो है शादी पे आया हुआ एक मेहमान सुनाता है. And then you can say narrator shift from guest to mariner himself, and mariner narrates the terrible sequence of events which followed when he shot an albatross and was cursed. You can say that is the important event of the poem कि mariner से एक albatross परिंदा जो है वो मारा जाता है और उसके बाद वो समझता है कि उसने जो है पूरा नेचुरल ऑर्डर जो है उसे तबाह कर दिया है. उसके अंदर एक एहसास गुनाह या गिल्ट जो है वो आ जाता है और वो समझता है कि अब वो कर्स्ड सोल है और उसे जो है वो सेव होने के लिए, निजात पाने के लिए जो है इसकी तलाफी करनी, तो तड़पता रहता है. यही वो आइडिया है जो वैसे तो तकरीबन अक्सरियत मज़ाहिब ने दिया है कि इंसान जो है गुनाह करे और उसके बाद जो है वो फिर क्या उसे कहते हैं पछतावा और तौबा करना शुरू कर दे, और फिर जो है वो अल्टीमेटली जो है उसको बख्शिश दी जाती है, माफी दी जाती है और उसको नजात मिल जाती है। तो ये थॉट तो बहुत सारे रिलीजन में, लेकिन क्रिश्चियनिटी के साथ ये एसेंशियली एसोसिएटेड थॉट है। सिन, repent, sin, and sin, we can say, if we recall the first sin of Adam, after sin there is fall, and after fall there is repentance, and through repentance man regains the grace. So in ancient mariner, whose story was told by a guest, mariner tells that he uh, when he shot an albatross, he felt that he was a cursed man. His ship is becalmed, he is subjected to nightmare visions and to a long period of suffering, and his water supply runs out in punishment for his deed. Mean events after the killing of albatross are ship is becalmed. अब चूंकि जब कोई गिल्टी इंसान होता है तो वो सारी चीजों को इंटरप्रेट भी अपने उसी वर्ल्ड व्यू के साथ करता है, जिससे बहुत सारी चीजों में आप जिंदगी में इसकी मिसालें ले सकते हैं कि एक इंसान जो है समझता है कि मैंने ये गुनाह किया था, उसकी वजह से ये चीजें मेरी जिंदगी में हुई। हो सकता है उन दोनों चीजों का आपस में कोई ताल्लुक ना हो, लेकिन जो बिलीफ है जो वो इस तरह से इंसान को जो है वो समझाता है। तो a mariner believes that his ship is becalmed because of his sin. Then he has nightmare visions. That also shows his perturbed soul, and he has, you can say, a chain of suffering. And one is, you can say, his inward restlessness, and other is outward, you can say, challenges. And last challenge is drought or water shortage. When the mariner blesses some sea creatures, his offense against the power of nature is forgiven. यानी ये उसका गिल्ट जो है उसे उसकी दिल को नरम कर देता है, और वो जो है वो बाकी समंदर की मखलूक पर मेहरबान होता है। एंड इन दिस वे ही पेज एक्सपिएशन, कफारा अदा करता है। हिज ऑफेंस इज फॉरगिवन एंड ही इज एबल टू रिटर्न होम a wiser man through his suffering. Learning through suffering, wisdom through suffering, that's an ancient idea of both tradition, Hellenist या Greek tradition and Hebrew tradition, that is, you can say, tradition of Judo-Christianity. So he represents the very idea. He becomes a wise man after that horrible experience of killing an albatross, facing a chain of suffering, and finally he enjoys forgiveness. That's a long poem, but its tone is like a medieval ballad. Ballad are those, you can say, song-like poems which can be easily recalled. They have power that they can stay our mind. Day after day, we stuck nor breath nor motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Water, water everywhere, and all the boats did shrink. Water, water everywhere, not any drop to drink. These are the famous lines quoted from this book. You can see they are being told in the style of ballad, in the style of nursery rhyme, and that paint actually the first they paint this state of draft or state of spiritual draft of mariner. Even from these lines, it is possible to see something of the allegorical or symbolical power of poem. Lack of water represents dryness of spirit, dryness of soul. Becalmed ship symbolizes aimless soul of man, यानी भटकता हुआ किसी जगह जो है रुका हुआ इंसान, जो जहाज है वो एमलेस सोल ऑफ मैन को जाहिर करता है. एंड aimless soul has committed sin and waits eventual redemption. And redemption is through repentance, through good deeds, and expiation. Explicit moral is essentially Christian. These are the lines again from the poem, and we can say everyone can recall, even they seem less, you can say, creation of a poet, more you can say directly borrowed from Ecclesiastes. He prayeth well who loved well both man and bird and beast. He prayeth best who loved best all things both great and small. For the dear God who loved us, he made and loved all. That lines definitely show Christian idea of, you can say, love and worship, because in Christianity, prayer is not so important as love is, or that's why he prayeth well who loved well. So यानी religious worship भी है, but worship can be valuable when there is love. And he prayeth who best who loved best all things both great and small. So all living beings, they can follow the same principle, and God who made human beings, he loves all his creatures. Conclusion of the poem is: a sadder and a wiser man, he rose the morrow morn. I mean, that's the romantic idea, that's the development of man. And we can recall William Blake's idea from this phase of innocence to phase of experience. So that's the best poem of Coleridge, that can be called unfinished epic, that can be called a ballad, that can be called an allegory. Other poems by Coleridge explore a mystical and supernatural world, like Christabel. Christabel, also written in a medieval ballad form, and is an allegory in which sinister and grotesque images from a distant past have an everyday reality. Christabel poem, you can say again, mundane and supernatural are mixed in this poem. And then next is Kublafaan. That's its subtitle is a fragment. Again, you can say a poem that seems, you can say, complete, but actually the poem, as poet planned, he couldn't complete it. Reason is thought, when he was writing the poem, Kublafaan, he was in a state of trance. And in that state of trance, when he finished, you can say, first half of the poem, the door was knocked. When the door was knocked, the poet actually came out of the state of trance, and then he consciously tried to, you can say, extend the poem, but conscious part, that's the second part of the poem, second half of the poem, that seems different. In Kublai Khan, Coleridge presents an exotic landscape that's you can say, of East. East was exotic or land of Xanadu, which has often been interpreted as symbolizing the movement of creative imagination. Poem opens with a contrast between the river of and the pleasure dome, a source of deep perception and understanding. There is a king Kublafaan who actually orders to build the stately dome, and he imagines that uh, you can say from his dome he can see fertile lands and uh, the things which are you can say presented, they are in symmetry, and the poem presents, we can say, as that's a painting, and a music of the rhyme, and the painted image created through words, they make a symmetry, and in this way it becomes a great piece of art. uh, Kubla Khan, who is the king, he was actually describing uh, his imaginary dome when he echoes the warnings of his ancestors. That is a realist voice in the poem. When he hears the voice of his ancestor that is about threats of war. So you can say he is in both world, the world of imagination, where he imagines how his dome should be, and the world of reality, where he is quite aware of the threats to his kingdom. In second half of the poem, the poet tries to, uh, you can say, make a complement of the first one, adding an image of damsel, Abyssinian damsel, who is playing upon her dulcimer. But he feels that still it seems, uh, you can say, uh, abrupt or redundant. And he concludes the poem with the lines, who will make that dome? And he thinks that who has been fed upon the manna, and who has drunk the paradise milk. That is also the beauty of this poem, that it is a complete statement of a vision, and vision can only be communicated in parts and fragments. यानी जब हम अपना कोई ख्वाब बयान करते हैं तो उसको जो आदमी बताएगा कि जैसे हमारे बहुत सारे लोग तो ऐसे ड्रीम बताते हैं जैसे सामने कोई पेंटिंग लगी हुई है या कोई फिल्म चल रही है तो उसको वो बता रही, तो डेफिनेटली ये बात जो है हम समझ सकते हैं कि ये झूठ पर ही मबनी होती है. हाउ इज इट पॉसिबल कि ड्रीम कैन बी रिकॉर्ड विद दैट एक्यूरेसी? Dream in its nature is fragmentary. So Kubla Khan's vision, if it has been presented as a fragment, that you can say indirectly shows its power. This poem is much admired by New American criticism, and they believe that the poem is not about dome and building a pleasure dome. Rather, it is about poetry. So what poetry is, how it should be, that is described in this poem, Kublafaan. Coleridge's poem Dejection and Ode explores an occasion on which the poetic imagination fails, captures the permanent truth. Coleridge's determination to continue his search for transcendental understanding, to take drugs such as opium, he was the famous opium eater. Everyone knows, though John Keats was also partially opium eater, but the best opium eater is um, S.T. Coleridge. There is a critic, Thomas D. Quincy. He probably wrote a book about Coleridge, and the title is Opium Eater. Like a number of romantic writers, he wished to extend the power of his senses and intuitions as far as possible, even if he were to risk serious damage to his health. My genial spirits fail, and what can these avail to lift the smothering weight from off my breast, if it were a vain endeavor, though I should gaze forever on that green light that lingers in the west. I may not hope from the outward forms to win the passion and the life whose fountain are within. That is his dejection and ode that actually captures, you can say, a state of pointless. That you can say, melancholy is one of the traits of romantic poetry. It is easy to say, but how it can be captured, that is captured here. Or we can say somehow in a different way, that is captured in Ode to Melancholy by uh, John Keats. It is important to compare and contrast poetry Wordsworth and Coleridge. Both of them created a new kind of poetry, innovating in form, language, and subject matter, and creating a lasting influence on poetry. Coleridge conversation poems are very close to Wordsworth's poems. Poems such as Christabel and Kublafaan do indeed represent exotic and intensely mystical flights of the imagination. Yet, poems such as Dejection, Frost at Midnight, and This Lime Tree Bower My Prison are based on everyday observation. I mean, these are conversation poems. They reflect on universal issues such as relationship between parents and children, and intimate and conversational in tone. There was a poem of S.T. Coleridge that was a part of intermediate syllabus, that is called Youth and Age. Youth and Age and Water Ballad, these were the 2 points. Once they were part of intermediate first year English textbook, and Youth and Age, you can say, an example of that conversation points. In his later life, Coleridge didn't write. Uh, Coleridge complained uh, that poetic inspiration had deserted him, and he wrote no poetry during the last 30 years of his life. Indeed, he dedicated himself to philosophy and to literary criticism, and then he published his Biographia Literaria, which contains important discussion of the workings of the poetic imagination. So that's about S.T. Coleridge and two of his significant poems, Rime of Ancient Mariner and Kublafaan. So these two, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they represent senior romantics. And then we see young romantics. And among young romantics, first one is John Keats. John Keats is likewise a poet who reflected on the nature of poetry. John Keats' letters are most important documents and offer many revealing insights into the nature of poetry and many critical precepts which are still cited today as basis for the evaluation of poetry. So Keats was also a critic in a way, and to know his idea of poetry or nature of poetry, we consult his letter. Keats' idea that we hate poetry that has too palpable a design upon us, mean that is also a rejection of new classical poetry that actually used to impose design upon the poet. Like other romantic poets, Keats John Keats wrote poems which were incomplete, unfinished fragments of a larger vision. I mean, Keats में और Coleridge में हम ये shared point समझ सकते हैं कि there were unfinished fragments of a larger vision. He, like other romantic artists, died at a very young age before fulfilling his potential and completing the poetic journey he had begun. By the age of 25, I mentioned in one class 25 and 10 months, he had written a major body of work containing some of the most memorable poems in English language. Keats' best-known poetry was composed 20 years after the publication of Lyrical Ballad. Actually, Lyrical Ballad that was published in 1798, and Keats was hardly 5-6 years old at that time. So that was afterwards. Although Keats' poetry is contrasted with that of Wordsworth and Coleridge, they remained an important influence on his work and his theories of poetry. Though senior romantics didn't consider much Keats' poetry, and we know that Wordsworth was actually a bitter critic of Keats' poetry, and Keats had only some help from Leigh Hunt, another romantic poet of the age who wrote famous poem Ibrahim bin Adam, Abu bin Adam. Abu bin Adam was a poem by Leigh Hunt, and Leigh Hunt was an editor of a magazine of poetry, and Keats' poetry was published in that magazine, and he even used to rectify the errors of Keats' poetry at that time. But Keats was a poet who could appeal to, you can say, the generations after generations who can emerge as a universal poet, but Leigh Hunt couldn't survive much. Wordsworth had a very low opinion about Keats' poetry. He even didn't like to call him a poet. And that was the criticism which is thought the cause of his death by another romantic poet, Shelley, when he wrote a poem Adonis about John Keats. A main theme of Keats' poetry is conflict between everyday world and eternity. यानी Keats की poetry का एक significant idea क्या है? Eternal world and temporal world. Everyday world of suffering, death, and decay, and the timeless beauty and lasting truth of poetry and the human imagination. So eternal world has beauty, eternal world has truth, eternal world has arts, order and creation. There is a timelessness of art, eternity of art, and Nightingale, whose song is, you can say, eternal. And on the other side, the real world is the world of pain and suffering. Earliest poem consists of long poems, such of them epic in style and concept. Endymion is written in 4 books and is derived in style and structure from Greek legends and myths. The main theme being the search for an ideal love and happiness beyond earthly possibility. A thing of beauty is joy forever. That is a famous quote from this poem, Endymion. A more ambitious long poem is The Fall of Hyperion, that is included in master syllabus as well. That shows an idea that there were titans, and titans were defeated because titans were defeated by the younger gods because younger gods were more beautiful. But among titans, there was a god Hyperion that was beautiful, and story of that god and his fall is the topic of this book, which is heavily influenced by John Milton and was not finished by Keats in part because he wished to develop his own style and identity as a poet. It tells of the downfall of the old gods and the rise of the new gods who are marked by their strength and beauty. The poem has been criticized for a lack of control in the writing. There are several places where sensuousness and precision of rhythm and image are combined. Sensuousness and precision, these are the features of his poetry, and they are also seen in Hyperion. Keats continued to write long narrative poems which allowed him to develop a characteristic feature of the style of all his poems: lush sensuous imagery which sports precise descriptive detail. Keats, like Coleridge, was also attracted to exotic settings of his narrative. These include mythic, classic background and medieval context of high romance. Isabella, Lamia, The Eve of Saint Agnes, La Belle Dame, Saint Mercy. These are his, you can say, work that explore romantic themes like relationship between emotion and reality, theme of impermanence of human love, theme of an elusive beauty. Unlike poets and philosophers of classical age who saw the medieval era as the age of darkness and superstition, Keats, like other romantics, was attracted by those times, especially chivalry of the period, as it is seen in La Belle Dame Saint Mercy. Oh, what can ail thee in the night at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sage is withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Night at arms. So, image of night is here in this poem. Keats was fascinated by Thomas Percy's relics of ancient English poetry and by the pre-romantic figure of the poet Thomas Chatterton, who committed suicide in 1770 at the age of 18 and who forged copies of medieval love, medieval ballads. Keats' ballads were written within a 2-year period. In fact, the year saw an intensely creative period of Keats' life. The odes explore of fundamental tension and contradictions. Keats' best poetry is seen in his ode. An ode is a poem in which something or someone is addressed. Keats is a song or ballad in which something or someone is addressed. Nightingale is addressed, Psyche is addressed, Melancholy is addressed, and Grecian Arm is addressed. These are famous odes of John Keats. Keats finds melancholy in delight, pleasure in pain, and excitement in both emotional sensations and intellectual thought. Keats contrasts dreams and reality, imagination and actual, tangible and the intangible. Keats also celebrates beauty, but at the same time, he knows that all things of beauty must fade and die.